Chapter 3 of Travels and Adventures of an Orchid Hunter by Albert Millican. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3: The La Guayra and Caracas Railway. We were delighted to learn that the latest novelty here is a railway from La Guayra to Caracas, the principal town of Venezuela. We gladly took tickets to the far end, pleased to escape from the heat and at the same time to see the country. If a tunnel could be drilled through the mighty mountain, the distance from the port to Caracas would be 5 miles, but the railway is 27 miles in length, winding about amongst the mountain passes in the most fantastic zigzag crotchets, gaining in the 27 miles an altitude of over a mile. The train is made up of the engine, 1 first and 2 second-class carriages, mere frames to catch as much as possible of the sultry breeze. The front of the engine is provided with 2 bags of sand and a boy on each side to put the sand on the rails, providing the wheels should revolve without making progress in the steep ascent. After the usual ceremony which accompanies all kinds of business in this country, the last portly old dame, with an enormous basket of fruit and some chickens, was effectually stowed away in a corner, and we started on the journey, at first along the shingly beach, passing a horde of miserable tumble-down huts, then through a fine plantation of cocoa-nut palms, for several miles of level road. Here began the ascent of the mountain, and at the point where we lost sight of the fine sea view, together with the harbour and town of La Guayra, we had already gained a 1/4 of a mile in height. Still we continued, here winding around enormous boulders, further along crossing deep ravines of 500 feet in depth on flimsy bridges, over which it seemed scarcely advisable to trust human life. At one point creeping along the mountain side with a height of half a mile above and as much of almost perpendicular precipices below, among scenery that would vie with the Alps in grandeur, but where the breaking of an axle tree would probably submit us to a fate compared with which the Tay Bridge accident would be merciful. The passenger cannot fail to notice the extraordinary structure of the tunnels. At some points, where a more than ordinary splinter of rock comes in the way, a pigeon hole had been drilled through the hard stone and left without any superfluous padding of brickwork. And so the scenery and the structure of the railway continued all the way to Caracas, so admirable in fact that no visitor who comes to La Guayra should miss the sight. On arriving at Caracas we were prepared to feast our eyes on the usual incongruous collection of tumble-down mud huts so peculiar to these parts of South America, and the reader can imagine our agreeable surprise when we steamed proudly into a smart little station of quite European pretensions, with clean cemented platforms ornamented with flowers and creeping plants, and thronged by an aristocratic class of people who appeared, by their dress at least, to be fresh arrivals from Paris. On leaving the station a pretty church of elegant design, built on a slight elevation, attracts the attention of the sightseer by its spotless white towers. 5 minutes' ride in a tram car brings us to the large commodious houses and wide streets of the principal part of the town. The largest square, or plaza, although somewhat small and cramped in comparison with the size of the buildings surrounding it, is gay with flowers, and 2 large splashing fountains in the gardens of the municipal buildings do their best to give the place an air of coolness, in spite of a sun sometimes more than oppressive. The presidential residence and government offices are buildings of excellent design and substantial construction. One side of the plaza is taken up by a large college for high-class scientific education, an institution which is a real ornament to the situation. It is a pity that Venezuela does not possess more such. 5 large magazines and stores, several excellent hotels, restaurants à la Française, and so much convenience for business and pleasure are to be found in the pleasant little Venezuelan capital that if there should be a European who still entertains the idea that there is no society to be found in South America but wild Indians, he will do well to pass a week at Caracas to improve his education. For my own part, the thought that the Phantom was perhaps already under way made it impossible for me to get more than a glimpse of the town, hastily swallow a cup of the celebrated Caracas coffee, and take a return ticket for La Guayra. I would have willingly stayed to collect the lovely Cattleya mossiae, which is found in plenty growing on the branches of trees in nearly all the mountains around Caracas, and is now to be had with the greatest ease, for the Indians bring large quantities of plants into the city for sale at a very nominal price, instead of the poor plant collector having to brave all the dangers of the forest, as in other districts, only to obtain a few dozen plants. One thing struck me as being more extraordinary than all the peculiarities of the people, country, or constitution. That is, that on a railway where every mile presents 1,000 dangers, no enterprising life assurance company had so far speculated on human vitality as to issue assurance tickets. In the descent of this single line of goat's track the magnificent scenery appears even more beautiful than on the upward journey, and the track itself, if possible, more dangerous, for the passengers cannot help wondering where we would stop, providing the brakes fail to act, on a railway which descends 1 mile in 27 miles of distance. On arriving at La Guayra we quickly engaged boats for the ship, and got on board just as the Phantom was firing a parting salute, no doubt to do honour to the officious custom house officers. We were quickly on our way for the harbour of Puerto Cabello, meanwhile congratulating ourselves that we had received the value of our 17 shillings with compound interest. A few hours' sail, always in sight of the rugged coast of Venezuela, brought us to the harbour of Puerto Cabello, a large old-fashioned lighthouse in the form of a Chinese pagoda, and a still older castellated fort, whose 100 pigeon-holes bristle with pigmy cannon, which seem more fit subjects for a curio museum, or to be used in some mimic theatrical representation, than to be of any service in modern warfare. These are the first and almost only objects of interest the situation affords for the traveller. The harbour being commodious enough to admit of ships coming to land, we dispense with the services of the black boatman and walk on shore. Mr. Conn, the excellent British consul, is always ready to welcome visitors, but the very ordinary and somewhat neglected appearance of the town does not offer much temptation to voluntarily stay long in Puerto Cabello. The harbour affords excellent convenience for the exportation of coffee, minerals, and other products of a large tract of country, and a large amount of business is done. Everyone here seems to be as much on the alert to turn a penny as the people of Caracas are to display a new suit or a bonnet. 2 small public parks, both crowded with gorgeous flowering plants, give one an idea of the almost spontaneous vegetation of these parts. In one of the gardens are 12 magnificent palms, each towering to a height of nearly 100 feet, specimens of exquisite beauty, enough to make the least covetous wish that they could be transported, just as they are, to Hyde Park or Kew Gardens. The only pity is that the last time the people of Venezuela indulged in a revolution, a quantity of the bullets, intended for other purposes, pierced the stems of the palms and disfigured them with many ugly marks. For those who care to see the country, a well-made line of railway runs from the port to the town of Valencia, or better still, take a horse and ride to the nearest village on the hills, a journey of about 3 hours, where the beautiful scenery and rich vegetation of the wild, uncultivated forest amply repay the exertion. As the Phantom was lying in port for the night, within a short distance of the fort, those who passed the time on board were treated to a peculiar concert, at first novel enough, but eventually disagreeably monotonous, in the fort now used as a prison. There are something like 300 unfortunates who, for the time being, are deprived of the privilege to roam the wild hills of Venezuela. They are guarded by a dozen sentinels, at equal distance from each other around the fort. It seems to be the duty of each one of these to cry out at the top of his voice the two Spanish words, "Centinela alerta," every half hour of the night from sunset to daylight, leaving an interval of 2 or 3 minutes between each one, beginning with the first man and continuing until the circuit of the fort is made. Perhaps the most amusing part of the system is the difference in the tone of the various voices. The first one will roar out the password in deep, sonorous tones. No sooner has this died away on the still night air than the next one begins with a shrill, piping treble, this in turn giving place to another who, in a soft, singing voice, prolongs the 2 words to twice their ordinary length, while a fourth, seemingly impatient at being disturbed, jerks out the words in a sharp military rattle, and so on until the 12th one proclaims them all "Alerta," in a tone at least an octave higher than his predecessors. As the vessels are moored almost directly under the walls of the prison, this half-hourly repetition of so extraordinary a comedy renders sleep utterly impossible, and we were not sorry when next morning the Phantom steamed out to sea, and so gave us a chance of a nap in the cradle of the deep. Our next calling place was the island of Curaçao, and in the short sail from Puerto Cabello nothing occurred worth the attention of the reader. To the traveller whose business is to investigate the beauties of foreign lands, the first impressions of the island are anything but satisfactory. As far as the telescope can reach, nothing is to be seen but an expanse of sandy desert or barren rocks, and these, if not entirely devoid of vegetation, only produce a weedy scrub. However, this monotony is soon relieved by our coming in sight of the whitewashed walls of the old-fashioned Dutch town. 2 well-garrisoned forts form a sufficient protection to the town and harbour. In passing the Dutch ensign which floats from the top of the fort, the captain of the Phantom, in pursuance of certain laws of maritime etiquette, politely dipped the Union Jack 3 times in the water, a compliment which was as politely returned by the Dutchman, answering the salutation in the same form. The harbour, although presenting a most gay and busy appearance, is somewhat small and cramped, and it was with considerable exertion that our little Phantom was brought near enough to the quay to do business. The principal parts of the town are built on each side of the narrow harbour. Besides this, a kind of canal branches off into the other parts of the town, cutting the streets at right angles. The harbour, as well as the canal, is crowded with small boats for the convenience of passengers who are obliged to be crossing and recrossing from one street to another. These boats, generally a kind of punt, are a most primitive cockleshell contrivance, which, however, at one time may have been a Dutch patent. They are perfectly flat bottomed, and not more than 1.5 feet deep, reminding one very forcibly by their general appearance of a large drinking trough. The mode of propelling them is scarcely less comical than the craft itself. The oarsman takes up his position standing in the stem of the boat, with a piece of wood in the form of an overgrown mustard spoon, which he wriggles from side to side in the water, in imitation of the action of a fish's tail. For the price of a few tiny coins, something less than half a farthing each, crowds of people of all classes, in search of business or pleasure, are conveyed from street to street, if not with the greatest swiftness, certainly with the greatest security, as, up to the present, an accident has never been known. The language spoken here is perhaps the most curious of the novelties which attract the attention of the stranger on arriving at Curaçao. The extraordinary arrangement of sounds called Creole Dutch strikes upon the ear as something between the growling of dogs and the cackling of poultry, an arrangement of gutturals and nasals equally as difficult to describe as it is to understand. It appears to me to possess neither rules nor system, but should it have both to the initiated, it is certainly devoid of beauty of euphony. The people seem to be preoccupied with a quiet industry so peculiar to the character of the Dutchman. Scores of women are employed in making a kind of straw hat of soft white grass, very inferior, however, to those made in many parts of Colombia. Another class of industry carried on here on a considerable scale is the manufacture of gold and silver ornaments in filigree work, and considering the great want of convenience and machinery, many of the specimens are very beautifully made. Although there was very little of importance to make anyone regret leaving the dreamy little town, we were abruptly called away by the shrill whistle from the Phantom before we had time to get a fair look around. Chapter 4. Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.